Hello, everyone. Lately, we've been spending a lot more time at home than you're probably used to. But what do you love best about where you live? When you do travel away from home, what do you like best about coming back home? I've had the opportunity in my life to take several trips far away to other countries. Traveling the world can be a lot of fun. It's a great way to learn about the world God created and experience the cultures of different people, all of whom are loved by God. But it can also be great to come back home after being away. That was especially true for God's people, the Jews, who had been away from their home for 70 years. They finally got to return home. Can you imagine how it would feel to come home after being gone for so long? We will find out more about that today. Before we begin, let's review our big picture question and answer. How is Jesus the perfect prophet? Jesus perfectly reveals God the Father and fulfills what the prophets spoke. That means that Jesus' words, thoughts, and actions perfectly showed what God the Father wanted. Because Jesus is God the Son, he has all power and authority. Every prophecy in the Old Testament led to Jesus, and all God's promises will come true in Jesus. We can trust God to keep his promises. The Bible is full of true stories about times when God kept his promises. The Old Testament prophet Jeremiah told God's people that because they kept disobeying God, they would be sent into exile. Remember, exile is when someone is forced to leave their country and move somewhere else. God's people were sent into exile to live in Babylon. The stories we learned about Daniel in the lion's den and the 3 friends being saved from the fiery furnace, those all happened in Babylon during the exile. Many years before God's people were taken captive, God also told Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years. Did God keep that promise? Of course. In today's Bible story, we will see again that God keeps his promises. Today's story comes from the Old Testament book of Ezra, chapters 1 through 3.
Many years before God's people were taken to Babylon, God promised the prophet Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years. Then, God would bring his people back home. God always keeps his promises. Cyrus, king of Persia, had taken over Babylon. God gave Cyrus an idea. Cyrus said, "Let all of God's people go back to Jerusalem so they can rebuild the Lord's temple. Give them gold and silver and animals. Give them gifts for God's temple." The exile was over. God's people were free to go back to their homes. God's people got ready and their neighbors gave them gifts, silver, gold, and animals and other expensive things. Zerubbabel and the high priest led God's people back to Judah. They had been away for 70 years. Many of the people were born in Babylon. They had never seen the land God had given their parents and grandparents. In all, thousands of people went back to Judah. They settled in their hometowns and set up their houses. Then, the people met together in Jerusalem to rebuild the Lord's temple. First, the priest rebuilt the altar in the same place it used to be. They followed all the laws of God for building. When the altar was finished, they offered burnt offerings to God. The people also obeyed the law about special celebrations. They had a festival like God had told them to do, and they made sacrifices to God. Then God's people gave money to stonecutters and carpenters who would work on God's temple. They paid people to bring cedar logs to Jerusalem. Finally, when everything was ready, the people started to work. They laid the foundation of the temple. The foundation was important. It would make the building strong. When the foundation was finished, The priests put on special clothes, and the people praised God. They sang, "The Lord is good. His faithful love will last forever." Then the people shouted and praised God. They were so happy. The foundation of the temple was complete. Not everyone was happy, though. Some of the older people remembered what the temple had looked like 70 years ago, before it had been destroyed. They cried. The noise of the crying and shouting was so loud that the people could be heard far away.
There were so many feelings and emotions in this story. Some people were excited because they were getting to go home and celebrate God's keeping his promises. Some people were nervous because they were traveling to a place they'd never seen but had heard stories about for years and years. God's people had gone through some pretty rough times during their exile in Babylon. Do you think God had forgotten about them? Of course not. God never stopped loving his children. They were his chosen people, and he had long ago promised that he would never leave them. In fact, God had been using their time in exile to glorify himself and bless the world. Many kings and people who didn't know God got to see his power and his love for his people. God had told his people through prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah that the exile would not last forever. When God makes a promise, you can believe he will always keep it. God kept his promise to his people, and they came home. During their time in exile, the people might have felt hopeless. Over time, they may have wondered if God had forgotten about them, or if God was really going to keep his promise. But God's plan for his people was bigger than they knew. Take a look.
Zerubbabel led God's people back to the temple to rebuild it. The temple was the place where God met with his people on earth. Jesus came to earth to rescue God's people. One day, Jesus will return to restore a greater home for all of God's people, and we will spend eternity with him.
Jeremiah wrote the words of our key passage to the people who were in exile in Babylon. Let's read what he wrote in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, together. I know the plans I have for you. This is the Lord's declaration. Plans for your well-being, not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. After 70 years of exile, God kept his promise to bring his people home. What God says is true. He has a plan, and he keeps his promises. Sometimes you may find yourself waiting on God's promise. God's plan doesn't always happen right away, but God's plan always happens at just the right time. Today we learned in the book of Ezra that God kept his promise to bring his people back home. God's people returned home to rebuild the temple. They laid the foundation and praised him. God is faithful. He has a plan, and we can trust him. I'll see you next time.